tell me when you want me to set off, John? Two or 3 minutes. Okay, that's fine. No problem. Good. A very nice young Kazakh, or half Kazakh, half Russian, came to my lecture and sent me an email, which I forgot to respond to, called Alina. I think she's Alina, do you know? Alina, is she Ivana? Or I can't remember. But she's doing a PhD, but she's just begun. I think she might be a bit icy. So if you come across it, you know, I'll send it. I will reply to it. Well, I'm sure she'll turn up. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Hello. Roman, we might have a word afterwards, because possibly meeting tomorrow. Yeah. It depends whether I die tonight. The temperature in my room is about -40. You know, and passionate squeaks to the works department has not yet secured me I've got a filthy cold. But if you could be my sort of funeral director, if all goes wrong. Of course. Well done. Where from?
I came all the way from Sussex. So there is actually a direct, almost direct train. And
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming. What do you think, John? Should I set off?
I think so.
Okay. Good. Good. The most exciting thing about this lecture is that I might actually pass out in the middle of it. Partly because I've got the most appalling cold cough, you name it, partly because I had my COVID and flu jabs this morning. Not a very intelligent combination, but anyway. Look, in a way I'm a fraud talking about the Ukraine, the crisis. I'm not a historian of Ukraine. I'm certainly not an expert on contemporary Russian or Ukrainian politics, and most of what I know about the war in any detail is what I see on my beloved YouTube and what my brother and one or two of my former PhD students tell me. Still, this is not a total view of what's going on. It comes from a strange angle, the angle of a historian of empire and of Russia. But every now and then, things coming from a strange angle have their advantages. Just to repeat, unless I pass out. Right, we won't mention that horrible possibility again. Look, I suppose the basic point I'd make about this is that what is going on now is of course horrible, was not inevitable, but actually surprises me less than the fact that the Soviet Union disintegrated with barely a shot fired in its defense. Certainly from the Western perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a sort of fairy story. The big bad enemy, with a genuinely rather unpleasant political tradition, not just disintegrated, but as I say, despite the enormous scale and reputation of its security services, barely a shot was fired in its defense. And blow me down, what came to power, as you might say in the short run, were people who said the West had been right all the time. I mean, fairy story isn't the word. And I do think that actually is one explanation why, end of history could float, Fukuyama's thesis, and why it resonated with a lot of Western policymakers and also significant sections of Western public opinion. Why am I not surprised? Well, for two, I suppose, basic reasons. One specifically to do with Ukraine, the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia. The other more generally, the end of empire. Start with the first. I mean, it struck me at the time that the Ukraine which emerged as an independent state in those borders in 1991 was always a relatively fragile creature. And both because of its internal fragility and because of Russia's very specific attitude towards Ukraine and Ukrainian independence, it also struck me that Ukraine could probably only survive, certainly only survive in peace and stability, so long as it was a bridge between Russia and the West. The second the Ukraine of 1991 was made, well, had to make fundamental choices between Russia and, in inverted commas, the West, even in terms of trade policy and economic orientation, let alone on issues of identity, ideology, you name it, and, of course, geopolitics. I always thought there was going to be a lot of trouble. I actually remember, rather sadly, a long lunch with Douglas Hurd, who was then the Foreign Secretary. This was when I was on the Foreign Policy Committee of the Centre for Policy Studies. And this was just as the Republican elections were coming over the horizon in the spring of '90. Douglas Hurd was no slouch. He was an intelligent man, and he understood about history, and he knew something about the collapse of the British Empire. Again, I think there were about 4 or 5 of us, but we just got more and more and more gloomy as we talked about the possible consequences of the disintegration of the USSR in general, and specifically Ukrainian independence. Problems for Ukraine? Well, one obvious problem is that a new state needs a unifying heroic myth, very often a myth of revolutionary nationalist struggle. And Ukraine didn't have that. Ukraine became an independent state, at least if you're looking at the narrow political context, more than anything else because the dominant section of the Communist Party leadership in Ukraine decided for its own reasons, many of which were rather far removed from a passionate belief in Ukrainian national identity, etc., but for their own reasons, that it made sense to abandon Moscow, throw in their lot with the independence movement, and, of course, by those means control the resources of Ukraine, which otherwise, and in the past, they'd always had to share with Moscow. And you could argue that given the increasing pressures from below, they had to control those resources if they were going to survive. Of course, it's true that there was a referendum, and it is also to the point that even in Crimea, though there only barely, a majority supported independence or staying in an independent Ukraine. But, life in 1991 was very confusing for the ordinary citizen. And it is also to the point that Gorbachev's own referendum, only 6-7 months before, a great majority of Ukrainians who voted had actually voted to stay within the Soviet Union. So without in any sense denying the legitimacy, and certainly in formal legal terms, the legitimacy of this new Ukrainian state, it didn't have much of a memory or myth or in a way history to sustain it. Except that in a way that's putting it wrongly. It had only too much history. It was just history of the wrong sort. Millions of Ukrainians had died violently on Ukrainian soil within living memory, a very large number of them at the hands of other Ukrainians, serving 2 extremely nasty regimes, Hitler's and Stalin's. The symbols and the memories, which were heroic for one side, one of the sides in Ukraine, were anathema to others. And that really, does matter, the flag, the trident, the lot. It is also the case that these divisions were territorial. They were very much rooted in the specific identities, memories, history, ethnic makeup of the varying regions of Ukraine. There was a huge difference between Galicia, the old Habsburg provinces, the cradle of Ukrainian nationalism, as it was called before 1914, and the Donbass out in the east. The Donbass, though, immediately begins to tell you some of the complexities. Simply putting the binary, are you Russian or Ukrainian, even more in the Donbass than in most other regions of Ukraine, was grossly to simplify and to expect an answer which the poor wretched person you were interrogating probably couldn't give. In the first place, there was a vast amount of intermarriage everywhere in Ukraine, but even more in the Donbass. Secondly, what is this Russian identity? Are you talking about the old Russian identity of the monarchy of pre-revolutionary Russia, which is what Putin is increasingly wrapping himself up in? Or are you talking about a Soviet identity? And if you're talking about a Soviet Russian identity, there is actually a sort of Soviet identity which unites a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, particularly of the older generation, and is not at all about making sharp divisions between Russians and Ukrainians. And then on top of the fact, there is a very powerful regional identity, not least because these are mining communities. So, they too have a very specific miner's identity. And that all brings out, the difficulties of trying to decide whether this region is going to belong to a state which calls itself Russia and is increasingly defining itself, as it has to do, in terms of pre-Soviet Russian history and identity, or this other state called Ukraine, which is defining itself as, depends, that's the argument, isn't it? And then, of course, you have Crimea. Crimea, they're probably here who know more about this than I do, but I can't leave it out completely. Firstly, you're dealing with memory. The sieges, Russian literature, Crimea, very important there. You're dealing with the fact that here it isn't just a Russian identity, it is a specifically Russian statist and military identity. The great naval base at Sevastopol. And, of course, all the geopolitics involved. It isn't a coincidence that when Putin makes his speeches, he often has the statue of Catherine II behind his shoulder. Under her, Crimea was conquered. The conquest of Crimea turns the Black Sea into a Russian-dominated lake. And a Russia which, when I was on Thatcher's committee, was contesting the hegemony of Central Europe, is now facing the risk of no longer being the dominant power on the Black Sea. That is the implication. If, well, it wasn't an entirely fanciful if, Western politicians, particularly American politicians, statements that Ukraine was going to join NATO, if that becomes true, then Russia's great naval base at Sevastopol becomes a NATO base. Well, that really is to get the tiger by his tail and give it a good target. It's not surprising that that stirs up the Russians. So, of course, we are onto the other reason why I have real doubts about the Ukrainian setup. It is the Russian involvement. And I'll come back to that later. But then there is the second big reason why, I'm a gloomy kind of character, and I always think the worst is going to happen. I'm astonished that the human race is still staggering along. But even so, if you knew anything about the end of empire, it didn't take much imagination to see just how nasty things could become. They haven't actually yet become as nasty as they might. One of the areas which I watched like a hawk in 91, 92, 93 was Kazakhstan. Although, Kazakhstan has always got 1/50th, except for people interested in oil, 1/50th of the attention of Ukraine in the Western press. It was, in theory, at least in terms of some kind of historical justice, an even more likely a place for a blow-up than Ukraine. Within living memory in Kazakhstan, you didn't just have a famine, which per capita was much more destructive even than the Ukrainian famine, because after all you were trying to collectivize nomads. You had the whole repertoire of, purges, the lot. You also had the pretty brutal Tsarist repression of the 1916 rising. And then you have to remember that in the early 1950s, in very recent memory, Khrushchev conducts a vast-scale last land grab by Europeans, Russian and Ukrainian peasants on the whole, at the expense of, in inverted commas, Asians. In other words, the virgin landscapes. So there are an enormous number of skeletons shallowly buried. And in different circumstances, that might well have been exploited. It wasn't for all sorts of reasons. The Kazakh elite is different to the Ukraine, all sorts of things. Nazarbayev, I think, did a good job. And, of course, we aren't out of the woods. these memories, these skeletons are still there and in certain circumstances could be exploited with dire results. But, all I'm trying to say is things may look awful now, the Lieven usual argument. The one, my great motto when I taught students, my motto at the beginning of the year, it can always get worse. But if you are looking at the end of empire, I think for four main reasons, the end of empire is usually a source of enormous conflict. The first reason is that empires, by definition, are very great powers. The demise, or even the major weakening of a very great power, creates ructions in the international system. It creates geopolitical holes, vacuums. It creates temptations, it creates resentments, it creates humiliation, etc., 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 etc. Anybody who knew anything about Russian and Soviet Russian elites knew just how much empire mattered to them. Now, you have to be a bit careful about this word empire, because it has, connotations in Russia which are not quite the same as it does in the West. Empire, to a great degree in Russia, and I think this is correct, it's my definition as well, is very much to do with being a very, very great power. It's not just to do with ruling over lots of different peoples, not Russians. It's to do with being a very great power, being one of the leaders of the world, having a major historical role. This matters enormously for Putin and crew. And suddenly to be demoted almost overnight without actually having obviously lost a war, demoted because your own leader, Gorbachev, had, for his own reasons, played a big role in disintegrating the Soviet communist system. That was difficult to swallow and accept. Relegation from superpower to international beggar, very difficult. The second reason why the end of empire usually brings tremendous conflicts is that empires, by definition, are made up of many, many peoples who are intermingled. It's not always true. You do get, obviously, concentrations of one people in one area, but there is usually, particularly in the cities, once you're coming into the modern era, but often in the countryside as well, a tremendous intermingling of peoples defined in ethno-linguistic terms. That doesn't matter so much if you're in an empire. It doesn't matter so much partly because people are habituated to living together. Empires usually looked with a certain degree of benevolence on multi-ethnicity. In any event, in the last resort, it doesn't matter so much because the people aren't sovereign. In a traditional empire, the emperor is sovereign. Even in Austria before 1914, where ethno-national conflicts are becoming, the core of politics, and there is a real risk, as is acknowledged, that the empire may disintegrate. Even there, in the last resort, if the German and Czech deputies in the Bohemian Assembly decide to dismantle the assembly and literally throw the chairs and benches across the aisle at their opposite ethnic enemy, in the end, of course, it's a bit depressing. But life goes on. The police, the army obey the emperor. He is sovereign, not any national community. At the lowest level, the communes go on. They are more mono-ethnic and they run an awful lot of things. The law courts go on. And after 20 years of hurling benches around, the sort of politicians get fed up, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a character, but there's truth to it as well. You suddenly then try to divide up an empire into nation states with clearly defined boundaries, and in almost every case, nation states, and certainly in the Soviet case, formally and officially, every case, defined as being the national home of some specific ethno-national historical group, linguistic group as well. And this ethno-national linguistic group is now the sovereign. And so you immediately begin to have all sorts of exciting arguments about who is or who is not the people. Sometimes who is not the people being, the more ferocious debate. It's entirely true that the existence of the Soviet republics and their borders, however to some extent artificial these borders might be, did play a crucial role in the more peaceful than violent demise of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, you know, it is true that these were never designed to be international borders, and you know, in every case they had problems. One issue which is worth pointing to is that, you know, in the Soviet Union, as is often the case in empires, minorities within minorities, in other words, Ossetians or Abkhaz in Georgia, Gagauz in, you know, Moldova, they did genuinely look to the Russians for support and protection against, you know, the local majority. And they did not take kindly at all to suddenly finding themselves in a newly independent Georgian or Moldovan republic, which, you know, in the excitement of independence was often pretty gung-ho about defining itself in Georgian ethno-national historical terms. It is entirely fair to say that Moscow helped to stir up the Abkhaz and the Ossetians. It is also entirely fair to say, and probably fairer to say, that Gamsa Khudia, you know, never put a poet in as prime minister, you know, stirred them up even more. And they didn't need much stirring. They didn't want to live in an independent Georgia, actually, but Moscow, for all sorts of reasons. Moscow was part for us. You know, if you've got to be basically ruled by someone else, you'd like them to be rather far away. And, of course, Russia offered more in terms, etc., etc., etc. All right, so the third point is time. It often takes a generation for the consequences of empire's collapse to come through. I mean, examples from South Asia. There can have been few more illogical states in history than the Pakistan, including what's now East Bengal and Punjab and, you know, the West, in one state. It was crazy. It was contrary to all logic and history and simple, you know, communications a lot, but it lasted for a long generation. It blew up in the end, you know, revolution, civil war, very nasty ethnic cleansing, you name it. But it lasted for a whole generation. And if you're going to sort of the other end of South Asia, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, you know, for what, 20 years after independence, basically, you know, rather civilized oldies who, I'm sure they were nationalists, but they were also brought up, maybe half of them been to Oxford or Cambridge, you know. They basically shared a lot of the attitudes of their British rulers, whom they actually often got on with very well. You know, Tunku Abdul Rahman in Malaysia would be an obvious example of that. So, I mean, in the Ceylonese, and specifically Sinhalese sense, it takes a generation before genuinely democratic, in inverted commas, Sinhalese ethnic nationalists begin mobilizing deep down and replacing, you know, the old hierarchy, the whole old system of deference, you name it. And it isn't actually very pleasant. And that their mobilization of Sinhalese nationalism, their attempt to equate the Sri Lankan state and polity with Sinhalese identity is enormously important in starting off the Tamil revolts, which, you know, result in a lasting, very unpleasant war. And although the central government did win the war in the end, which does, you know, warn one that this idea that wars never solve anything is wrong. They often solve a great many things. Nevertheless, you know, the Tamils are still there and the problem could certainly re-emerge at some point. So it takes time, you know. You can have immediate mayhem and bloodshed, you often do. But the fact you don't doesn't mean that necessarily you won't. And of course, the great, great example of this is Germany after 1918-19. Endlessly cited, and actually correctly so. Sometimes, you know, one's not allowed to cite the German case because less now than 10 years ago, and with some justice, people said, you know, you're playing to Western shibboleths and, you know, three-syllable understandings of world history. And everyone's going to go away saying you've described Putin as Hitler. Well, Putin isn't Hitler. Not least because he doesn't have Hitler's maniacal sort of genius, if you like, for stirring up populations. He's a bureaucrat. He's more, you know, you've got one or two people like him in East Central Europe between the wars. He's not a charismatic leader. He got there as much as anything by accident, and his basic instincts are those of the office, not of the hustings and the charisma. I mean, Mussolini was a dreadful man, but as I point out to people who try and compare Trump to him, Mussolini was also, he had elements of being a dreadful great man. There's none of that in Putin, really, not in my view anyway. But actually, in pointing to the German example, I'm not trying to make comparisons with the Nazis, though strong elements of fascism certainly now exist in contemporary Russia. I think even without Hitler, the German elites and much of the population would have challenged the Versailles settlement in the East. There were very few Germans who thought that the cession of the Sudetenland to the Czechs was legitimate. There were very few Germans who thought that the cession of much of Silesia, or indeed of Danzig, to the Poles, was not part of Germany, was legitimate. And I think the challenge would have come in time. But it would have been time because in just the same way that Russia, Germany is on its knees in 1919. The victorious allies are all powerful. Neither of those things are true by 1933, not after the crash and the Great Depression. The final point to make is that land empires are by definition almost always more inclined to mayhem than overseas empires when they collapse. And there are reasons for this, but the most obvious, again, is entirely simple. When you were talking about a land empire, you were talking about the former metropolitan core of the empire, the imperial nation, and usually still the most powerful polity in the region, being directly involved in its neighborhood, in its old colonies, if you want to call them that. Its resentments, its sense of humiliation, but also, its desire to have all its own ethno-linguistic group in its own polity. All these are directly relevant. I mean, there's been a civil war in Myanmar ever since the British left. There are very few people in Kent who think about Myanmar. Kent and Myanmar are a long way from each other. That is not true in a land empire. And when you remember that 25 million Russians were living outside the borders of the Russian Federation when the USSR collapsed, and then you remember just what trouble far smaller groups of Pieds-Noirs in Algeria, Protestants in Ulster, kicked up when it looked as if they were going to get dumped, or might get dumped in some, in the Irish state, or even, notionally, some kind of Algeria. Well, 25 million Russians was something to conjure with. Again, the surprising thing is we haven't heard more from them. But again, these things take time to come through. The one place where the British did not succeed in jettisoning an empire and escaping from the consequences, of course, was Ireland, which is the closest that the British Empire came to having, a land border with one of its, if you want, colonies. Actually, it's interesting, and certainly this lunch, that's what we spent our whole time doing, went on for hours, talking about the consequences of the collapse of the British Empire with Douglas Hurd, who had, after all, as indeed had I, almost been blown up by the IRA on one occasion. So he was quite sensitive to arguments about parallels with the demise of the British Empire. Basically, at least from their own perspective, the British managed the end of empire relatively well, by which I mean better than the Dutch, the French, and the Portuguese. They did not find themselves mixed up in very unpleasant wars of decolonization, which they proceeded to lose. In very many cases, Malaysia would be the most obvious, but there are others. The British succeeded in at least half winning the wars of decolonization, and therefore putting in power after they had gone, certainly in the parts of the former empire they cared more about, regimes which were relatively sympathetic to Britain and its interests. The British also, in terms of their own pride, to some extent, you wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but to some extent, found some solace for injured pride, reduced status, in the Commonwealth even, and certainly in the Cold War partnership with the United States, which carried on the immensely successful and rather moving World War alliance against Hitler. And it did give British elites a sense they were still major players. And this is very important, they were, after all, conceding power relatively gracefully to a country which was part of their own ethno-linguistic historical camp. You know, I'll certainly talk about it next week as well, about global politics from about 1870 down to 1991. As much as anything being between three camps which were both geopolitical and ethno-linguistic historical: the Germanic bloc, the Anglos, and the Russians, Russian Slavs, Russian communists. And the British were transferring power within their own bigger bloc to a country which shared most of their values and many of their interests, and whose dominion they could certainly tolerate and even prosper under. You know, for the Russians it is more complicated, suddenly finding themselves in a unipolar mode, unipolar world, you know, with the Americans dominant. Even so, I mean, you know, I hardly need to tell you, a good deal of that Tory elite, which I had something to do with, had by no means entirely got over you know, the inheritance of empire, some of the arrogance and illusions that went with it. But above all, when you're looking at the end of empire, you've got to look at the impact in the former colonies. And if you look across the present world, all the way from Ireland to Fiji, you can find endless conflicts which are still rumbling on decades, even generations after the end of the British Empire. And pretty obviously, you know, Palestine and South Asia top the bill. Look, we are still, well, the Indians and Pakistanis are still in conflict, frozen usually, but heating up sometimes, over Kashmir and over other issues. This was a quintessential post-imperial battle when the empire disintegrated over control of territories. And it has now cost how many wars? 3, I think, and is at the level of nuclear confrontation. Given the impact that climate change and possibly other things as well, again, have on the Indian subcontinent, you know, you would not underestimate the risk of things going very nasty indeed on the basis of that post-imperial conflict, which started in 1946-47. One very possible scenario for the Ukrainian crisis is that that is what we're going to have, a conflict which is not resolved, a ceasefire may come, and the ceasefire may hold for a bit, and then we'll have some more fighting and this and that. It is perfectly conceivable that you're going to be talking about a century of conflict, or even more. If you go back to the 1890s, and I, as you probably realize, often go back to the 1890s, that's when I'm not thinking I've defeated Napoleon. The chief legal advisor for the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Imperial Ministry, of course, a character called Theodore Martins, where am I? Oh, yeah, I'm doing all right, wrote that if the national principle, by which he meant to every people defined in terms of ethnicity, language, history, triumphed in the vast area of the world currently ruled over by the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Ottomans, there would be complete mayhem. And he was entirely correct. You know, it has taken 2 world wars, genocide in the fullest meaning of the word, and a vast amount of ethnic cleansing to turn the map of East Central Europe from a map of empire to a map of something one might describe as nation states. The Soviet Union was, in a sense, the last empire. It reconstituted most of the area of the old Russian Empire, and it was the sole survivor. When it collapsed, you were likely to have a rerun, and indeed we have, though not yet to the full extent that one could have imagined. As I mentioned, you know, I talked about the Kazakhs. Just think about it. The 2 great imperial diasporas of the Habsburg monarchy were the Jews and the German Austrians. One was, you know, pretty much exterminated, and the other was ethnically cleansed on a grand scale. That's pretty shocking. And the collapse of the Austrian Empire in terms of the geopolitical vacuum it created as was predicted and by many Austrian statesmen in the old days, did in time lead to a battle between the Germans and the Russians as to who was going to control that vacuum. And whoever succeeded in controlling that vacuum was going to be the dominant power in East Central Europe, and indeed the hegemonic power in the entire European continent, unless an outside power stepped in other words, the United States. So, there were plenty of warnings there. As for the Middle East, well, I think you could to some extent, I wouldn't want to push it, but you could to some extent say that we're still in the midst of a post-Ottoman crisis. I mean, the basic point, I think, is that the European model of ethno-linguistic state, rooted in history but also rooted in democratic citizenship, has not found it easy to put down roots in the Middle East, whereby tradition, loyalties went to Islam, various branches thereof, to the region, sometimes to dynasty, but not usually to anything you could think of as an ethno-linguistic nation. And, just to be even more optimistic, you do also have to remember that most of the great states of Asia, China, India, Indonesia, Iran, they are not empires in the full traditional meaning of the word, but they are a damn sight closer to being empires than they are to being the 19th century, early 20th century model homogeneous European nation state. And if ethno-linguistic historical nationalism really caught on in Asia, Gujarat for the Gujaratis, Aceh for the Achenese, there would be such mayhem that I suspect the planet wouldn't survive it, given all the other problems we have to cope with. So, this is a complicated and very dangerous set of issues that we're dealing with. When I talk to British audiences, and particularly to English ones, and I don't often get north of the border, so it's mostly English ones, I try and make comparisons between the collapse of the Soviet Union and its impact on Russians, and what would have happened had the British Empire collapsed in the 1930s, almost overnight, without a major war, to clarify matters in the eyes of the population. Sorry, where am I? 1930s. Where was I? Oh, yes. You'd have had to combine the collapse of the empire overnight, and remember, most British people at that time thought of the empire both as a fact of nature and as basically a benevolent institution. Suddenly disappeared, it would have caused them a good deal of bother, as you might say. But you'd have had to combine that with the secession of Scotland and Wales, Ukraine and Belarus, I suppose. You'd have had to combine that with the collapse of the constitutional monarchy and indeed of the parliamentary system, which is roughly the equivalent of the disintegration of the Soviet party state. And then on top of that, you'd have had to have a depression worse than the 1930s. The Russian male life expectancy, even more than female, though female too to some extent, plummeted in the 1990s in a manner you would usually associate with a sort of respectable war. All those things together would certainly have caused even the tea-swilling, rather phlegmatic English of the 1930s to get a bit bewildered and sad about life. But actually it's worse than that, because Scotland isn't Ukraine. No Englishman thinks that the origins of English statehood, the monarchy, or of the English religion are in Edinburgh, for the very obvious reason that they aren't. No English person, except a genuine maniac, has ever thought that the Scots were not a separate nation, a separate people. But of course, very many Russians did always believe that the Ukrainians were a branch of the Russian people, and that is what Tsarist official ideology, which the old elites and much of the old intelligentsia shared, also believed. In Tsarist ideology and much of Russian history writing before 1914, bringing in the Ukrainians and the Belarusians was not referred to as creating an empire. It was referred to as uniting the Russian lands, gathering the Russian lands. And then again, in the Russian case, it was entirely correct to say that the origins, to some extent, of the monarchy, and certainly of orthodoxy, lay in territory which was now part of the Republic of Ukraine. So, problems. Ukraine and Russia. Why do Putin and co care so much more about Ukraine than they do about any other former Soviet republic? Well, I think there are two elements to this. One is Ukraine as power. In other words, the enormous resources of Ukraine, but also the fact that if you count Ukrainians as Russians, then if you go back to 1914, 2/3 of the population are Russians. If you don't count Ukrainians or Belarusians as Russians, then it's only 43%. In one case, you're talking potentially of a national empire, like the German one, as the Russian sort of conservatives said. On the other, you're talking about a Russian empire like the Ottomans or Habsburgs. And that is something very difficult for Russian conservatives or nationalists, or indeed many liberals, to swallow. I wrote at the beginning of my book, Towards the Flame, that the First World War revolved around the future of Ukraine, and I will not go into that in any detail now, except just to say that without Ukraine, the Russia of 1914, the Russia of 1917, would cease to be a great power. Because on the lands of Ukraine were the core of the empire's export agriculture and the core of its metallurgical coal, iron, and to some extent, defense industry. Until Stalin developed the Urals West Siberian military-industrial complex in the late 20s and 30s, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. So there were enormous issues at stake there. As the more prescient Russian thinkers, Pyotr Struve, Mikhail Menshikov, on the center-right and the right, knew, and as indeed Pyotr Donavo understood as well for the government. By 1991, Ukraine is not as important as it was in 1914-17, partly because Europe itself is not as important. Europe is no longer the center of the world. Global geopolitics do not revolve around the German-Russian competition. But also because, as I've said, Russia's center of geopolitical gravity has to some extent shifted to the Siberia, oil, gas, etc., 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 etc. Nevertheless, in my view, and not everyone agrees with this, but in my view, it was the decision of Ukraine to secede in the autumn of 1991, which wrecked any chance of holding the Soviet Union together in some form of federation or even confederation. Because without the Ukrainians, you're probably going to be without the Belarusians as well. And without the two of them, what is a surviving Soviet state but a mechanism for allowing endless Central Asian immigration to Russia with rights of citizenship, plus a Russian obligation to subsidize these much poorer and peripheral republics, wasn't on. So Ukraine, even in 91, is absolutely vital to Russian power and to Russian empire defined both in terms of territory and multi-ethnicity, but even more in terms of power. And undoubtedly, for this elite round Putin, for whom, as I say, power, global status is absolutely part of their identity, what they see as their mission, you name it. This goes a long way to explaining why they're so obsessed about Ukraine. Sorry, I'm developing a great trope, so I shall. But the other issue, I think as important, is the one of identity. I mean, this is Putin's famous statement that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Well, what does one make of all this? I mean, I think you start, as always, by making the very obvious but often forgotten point that God did not create contemporary nations. Most people would agree that the English are a nation, a national people. But of course, if you go back far enough, you've got the Romano-Brits out in the west, the Anglo-Saxons in the middle, and the Scandinavians out in this neck of the woods. This is sophisticated geography I'm letting you into. The point is that over time, and it's been a long time, they have evolved into being a nation, partly because, after all, England is a rather small place. It's easier to integrate. Partly because you have had an enormous amount of economic, and that means also communications, integration and migration and all sorts of things. And of course, all these people have lived under the same state for over 1,000 years by now. And in the modern era, you can't even begin to enumerate all ways in which that has forged a relatively homogeneous national community. And one could go on forever, etc. Point about the Russians and the Ukrainians is that actually no Ukrainians, virtually no Ukrainians, were subjects of the Russian Tsar until the 1650s. And a quarter of Ukrainians were the subjects of the Habsburg Emperor down to 1918, and only were brought into the Soviet Union when Stalin annexed Austria and Galicia in 1945. Plus, on top of that, Ukraine and Russia are rather bigger places than England and much less tightly integrated, but either in economic terms, in terms of communications, in terms of education, the whole damn thing. I mean, if you're looking at Putin's view that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people, well, I think you could say that in 1850 you could make a pretty good case for that. And I think most educated Ukrainians would have agreed. Didn't mean that the Ukrainian gentry didn't often have a long, deep sense of local pride and a sense of regional identity. But then, after all, Yorkshire landowners, even if they've been to Eton, very often do have a sense of pride in being they did in those days anyway. But in political terms, most of the Ukrainian educated class, which in those days doesn't mean much more than the landowning class, do in political terms think of themselves as Russian. I mean, if you're talking about the whole area, what you just have to remember is that in pre-modern era, peasants don't have a national identity usually. Certainly Ukrainian peasants didn't. They were the people from here, as they still were in 1918. To the extent, they have firstly very limited horizons. They have the village identity. To the extent they have a broader identity, and this does not differentiate them from other peasantries, it tends to be linked to religion, to a sense of belonging to the Orthodox community. And there is a degree to which that itself is connected to the monarchy. The Tsar, the monarch, as the protector of the Orthodox community. The monarch in Russia, and actually in some pre-modern societies as well, as some idealized sort of demigod in the sky, some symbol of justice, some symbol of hope, in what was, of course, a hugely exploitative and very often wretched existence. Once you get down to 1914, things are hotting up fast, for obvious reasons. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before. Peasants into Frenchmen, Weber. Part of the business of the modern state is turning peasants into citizens, or turning peasants into people who share a sense of common identity and fate language with the elites. And that's absolutely splendid when you're talking about France, because there's no competition. Everybody's in the game of turning peasants into Frenchmen. It gets much, much nastier when you've got rival intelligentsias, or even rival states and their intelligentsias, trying to transform the peasantry into X or Y competing nationalities. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that by 1914, the bulk of the peasantry still doesn't have a Ukrainian national identity. But certainly a Ukrainian identity has spread far beyond just the landowning class. And it has spread to some extent in some pockets in the countryside as well. This was a huge, huge issue. I mean, it was a very interesting statement to the Joint Ministerial Council of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1912 by Count Berchtold, who was the foreign minister and had been ambassador in Petersburg for years. He said that, look, even if we can come to compromises with Russia in the Balkans, in the longer run, the Ukrainian issue is more serious for them, and therefore more serious for us. And it's hard to see how this is not going to lead to conflict. Because on Habsburg territory, initially with some help from the government, but above all simply because the Habsburgs allow this to happen, you do have, a very powerful sense of mass Ukrainian identity developing by 1914. And that is a threat to Russian statehood, as Berchtold makes it very clear. Well, if you're going on to 1991, Putin and co. go on about the fact that Lenin and the wicked old Bolsheviks, by creating a federal system, calling Ukraine, independent sovereign state, even for a time, but to some extent longer than that, you know, allowing the Ukrainian language as a language of primary education, even middle education. They have artificially created a Ukrainian nation where none previously existed, and they have also, in that sense, built on the foundations of the wicked Catholic Habsburgs, etc., etc. Look, I mean, of course, all the wicked is nonsense, but, you know, undoubtedly the institutions of Soviet federalism did contribute to a much greater sense of Ukrainian identity among much wider sections of the population than would have happened had you not had the federal institutions and, you know, Lenin's nationality policy and everything. But actually, I think at least as important was Stalin's annexation of Habsburg Ukraine in 1945. It is very interesting that my old hero, who you probably heard him going on about him, it's not every hero who has the chief of the Russian secret police, his photograph hanging over his bed, you know, that in his famous memorandum of February 1914 to Nicholas II, he warned him, among other things, that although the Ukrainian national movement was for the moment entirely controllable, if Russia, as the Russian nationalists wanted, annexed Habsburg Galicia, which Donovo called the cradle of Ukrainian nationalism, then things could very rapidly take some very dangerous and unexpected turns. You know, I think this is the point. In fact, I suspect that if Stalin had not annexed Western Ukraine, Galicia, and the Baltic republics, then the core of the Soviet Union might, at least for a time, have survived the collapse of communism. The sort of, the people in the lead as regards pushing nationalism and demanding secession were first and foremost the Baltic nationalities, but with the Ukrainian nationalists coming up behind, and of course inherently much more serious. So, you know, Russia could get rid of the Baltic republics and survive as a huge, powerful, if you want, empire, not Ukraine. And if it was naive and silly of Putin to think that the Russians and Ukrainians were one people in 1991, it was, you know, really extremely silly to think the same in 2022. According to my brother, and this is actually to the point, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, logically enough, since Russia is now becoming something you might call a nation state, the elite becomes much more Russian, unlike in Soviet times. After all, Khrushchev and Brezhnev were both, in a sense, lived in Ukraine. Or in Tsarist times, actually. The new post-Soviet Russian elite has very few people who really do know about contemporary Ukraine. And the one whom Putin chose to go out and create a sort of band of brothers who would, you know, be Russia's satraps once his plan had succeeded. Dmitry Kozak came back and told him, boss, it ain't going to work. We just can't find people of the status and the willingness to take on this role because they know it's hopeless. And of course the boss said, go away. By then the boss was, you know, committed to his own policy and was not going to listen to anybody else's opinion. So that brings me back to my last section, which is, you know, Putin's aims in 2022, and will he achieve those aims? I mean, I think his basic aim was to annex Crimea and the Donbass and to control the rest of Ukraine indirectly through his own stooges, as you could say, you know, in the tradition of empire, you do. I think you immediately at that point face a problem. When empires collapse, land empires, really the leaders of the former metropolitan imperial people have two choices as regards the areas which surround them. Either you can seek to annex border regions which you consider to be your own, either for historical or geopolitical, or more often for ethno-national reasons. Annex them and bring them back into what you now see as the national fatherland. Or on the contrary, you can try and keep them in the neighbouring states and use them as a Trojan horse so that you can, you know, control indirectly. It sounds simple. It's not always simple in the slightest, but still. But basically, you can't. It's very difficult to do both for obvious reasons. You know, if you annex Crimea and you annex the Donbass, you take out of Ukraine the most pro-Russian areas. Automatically, you therefore reduce Russia's natural weight within the Ukrainian political setup, you also equally inevitably infuriate most Ukrainians. You have to be extremely powerful and quite crafty to manage both simultaneously. Sorry, we'll have to have a brief pause. You could say that to some extent, the Soviet Union gets away with that policy as regards Finlandization in the Cold War. They do annex Finnish territory, and yet they do come to a modus vivendi with the independent Finnish state, which does mean that Finland is not a base for NATO, it doesn't join NATO, and it restrains itself as regards its foreign policy, while at the same time being allowed more or less total autonomy as regards internal matters. Well, firstly, as I say, that is under exceptional circumstances. The Finns have fought 2 nasty wars, suffered a lot. They can also see the example of that whole Soviet informal empire in Eastern Europe and realise that actually in comparative terms they're doing very well. If you're a Ukrainian in 2020, firstly, you think correctly that today's Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union. Secondly, you haven't fought 2 wars and suffered in the way that Finns had. And thirdly, you're not looking at Soviet, in inverted commas, satellites in Eastern Europe. You're looking at the independent states of East Central Europe and asking yourself why you can't be exactly that too. In any event, no sane Russian ever denied that the Finns were a separate nation, separate people, which Putin is denying. He's denying the legitimacy of any form of Ukrainian separate state, or at least he was then. Will he get away with it? Well, I think he will as regards the annexations, yes. I mean, it's very hard for me to imagine. Although, 50 years down the line, Ukraine becomes a paradise of sort of, liberal capitalism and Russia sinks into a swamp. You never know. I mean, but it's not likely. But I find it very hard to imagine, as I say, that Ukraine will ever get back either the Donbass or the Crimea. Actually, I myself tend to think it's not in Ukraine's interest to get them back. As regards the Donbass, firstly, this is Europe's biggest rust belt apart from anything else. It's now been fought over for 10 years. I mean, a cynic would say that actually what you want to do with this area is to leave it to someone else to clean up. I suspect most of the population, I don't know, this is off the top of my head, I suspect, or at least much of the population has voted with their feet by now. They've either gone east or west. I strongly suspect that if you've spent the last 10 years being shelled by Russians, you hate the Russians. If you've spent the last 10 years being shelled by Ukrainians, you don't have a very happy view of them either. I don't know, I may be wrong. And I am certainly, it's a ridiculous comment, but it's a sort of true one. Look, in the old days, my granddad and great-granddad used to own Donetsk, the mines and what became the city. They let it to a horrible Welshman called Hughes, which was why, and finally sold it to him, which is why it was called Hughesovka before the revolution. Well, in those days, that made us sort of cheerful third-class oil sheikhs in contemporary terms. Nowadays, someone tries to give little Lieven back, in inverted commas, Donetsk. He changes his name to Smith and emigrates to New Zealand. I mean, I just cannot see that this is an asset to anyone. Crimea is a different matter. Crimea is a different matter. But Crimea matters to Russians more than any other area which they lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if by some miracle you did get it back, I think it would be very hard for any Russian government to accept that without sacrificing its legitimacy. If a civilized government ever comes to power again in Russia, we would rather not lumber it with Weimar syndrome. But on top of that, and actually in some ways more basically, the Ukrainian state after the war ends, if it does end, is going to have an awful lot of problems. Does it really want to have to deal with millions of angry Russians in Crimea? No. Now, I realise that this is to some extent your pusillanimous argument. There is no two ways about it, that Russian annexation of Crimea was a gross breach of international law. Sure, I mean, gross breaches of international law happen all the time, but, twice guaranteeing by treaty the territorial integrity of your neighbour and then annexing its provinces is pushing things, a little hard, a little far. It's also, of course, the case that keeping Crimea for Russia is greatly, grossly unjust to Ukrainians who lived in Crimea, and above all to the poor, wretched Crimean Tatars. It does, I think, for them represent not genocide, because it's important to be clear about words. The Russians are not going to go and murder all the Crimean Tatars, but I think it does end any thought of, well, I think it is ethnocide in many ways. Any idea of any version of a Crimean Tatar community on its own, ancestral soil, exercising any degree of autonomy is dead. I'm sure a Global South critic would say that that is what the United States in particular, but Western Europe, are doing in supporting Netanyahu and co. Yes and no, no and yes, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. So again, it's difficult in international relations to, it's absolutely pointless to sit on a sort of moral high hill and preach. Because you might as, if you're going to do that, you might as well just sit in the bath and amuse yourself. It's not going to get you in it. You've got to have a level of realism. And realism means accepting power and circumstance. There are 4 times as many Russians as there are Ukrainians. It's very difficult to create a lasting territorial settlement against the most powerful state in the region. So it isn't nasty, but on the whole, if, and this is the other side of the equation, by ceding territory, you could secure the future of an independent Ukraine free from the threat of Russian bullying within the European Union with some version of security guarantees, etc., 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 well, might be worthwhile. And the examples usually pointed to are South Korea and West Germany, both of which, found themselves in countries which had been divided, but in the end made a huge success of partition, turned themselves into model economies, certainly, and in the German case ended up by reincorporating, the old Eastern territories. What will happen in Korea, we don't know. Is this achievable? I don't know. I really don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. In fact, nobody knows. Some people can make better informed guesses than I can, but security guarantees, it is to the point that West Germany was part of NATO and Korea had the American guarantee plus nuclear weapons, American nuclear weapons on Korean soil. That's not going to happen in the Ukrainian case. To get Ukraine into NATO, you'd need for a start a 2/3 vote in the American Senate. In present circumstances, 2/3 of American senators wouldn't even vote together to say they had 2 legs. Let alone take on the enormous burdens of bringing Ukraine into NATO, which would be giving it a guarantee almost of starting a nuclear war in the event of a major breakdown in Russo-Ukrainian relations. Nor is Washington going to give Kiev anything like the kind of guarantee which Seoul has from the United States, and which Putin would, Trump might even try and ditch. I doubt that. I think at last the American deep state would earn, some of its reputation and put poison in his soup if he tried to do that. Nor are you going to get a Pakistani solution. In other words, an independent Ukraine being allowed and able to acquire nuclear weapons. Whatever else is going to happen, the Russians are not going to allow that. And a Ukraine which tried to do that would not be supported in Europe, let alone in Washington. So, what kind of security guarantees are they going to be? And will they be halfway enough? Well, as I say, we could throw out all sorts of ideas. Joining the EU, well, that is a sort of security guarantee in a way. Bilateral agreements with the British and French and even the Germans, bit of the way as well. One thing to note is that you could be a neutral or neutralised country like Finland, or you can be a neutral and neutralised country like Austria.
The Finns may have been neutralised and not part of NATO, but they were formidably armed. A Ukraine which had some kind of protection against Russian nuclear blackmail, but which was allowed to join the EU and was, by treaty, allowed to, make military deals with other Western powers, etc., 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 would not be fully secure, but it would be a damn sight more secure than might otherwise be the case. Look, we don't know. Another point to note, though, is that one of the key elements in military security would be political stability in Ukraine, and that would also be crucial in terms of foreign investment. Ukraine doesn't have a particularly happy reputation as regards corruption or the rule of law. You also have a very familiar post-imperial syndrome. Think of Ireland in 1920-21. You don't fight heroically as a nationalist for independence. You don't suffer, as the Ukrainians have suffered, as to some extent, IRA soldiers had suffered, and then take very kindly to compromises which include ceding territory you think as the national heritage. And in Ireland, you've got a civil war. So one of the things that you're going to have to think of as regards Ukraine is avoiding those kind of conflicts within the Ukrainian elites when the moment comes that they have to accept some sort of territorial compromise. Now, they were not going to accept a territorial compromise in peace now, nor is Putin. The most you're going to get is a ceasefire, but it is possible that if a ceasefire lasted, once Putin's gone, you might be able to turn that into some kind of peace. You might not. There's no peace yet between the Russians and the Japanese, for God's sake, since 1945. But, there's no point just descending completely into gloom. That seems to me to be the least bad and most promising way forward. And it's pretty dark grey, even if it doesn't go completely black. The problem, though, of course, on top of everything else, is that there are just so many uncertainties. Uncertainties as regards whether the Ukrainian army will disintegrate in the next 6 months. I don't know. I'm not there. My brother is gloomy. Other people say, no, they'll last through the winter, certainly, because the winter will bring military operations more or less to a standstill. What's going to happen to Ukrainian politics as and when the issue of peace comes up? What's going to happen if Trump wins and tries to impose his version of a settlement and get the Europeans to pay for it but not have a vote in it? And then there are the bigger outside issues. It is well within the bounds of possibility. It's not yet probable, but it's well within the bounds of possibility that within 10 years' time we will be in a third world war. At which point all bets are off. If you want to be truly gloomy, you look at the Ukrainian business, the Middle Eastern business, a bit like the Italian invasion of, what I still call Tripolitania, and then followed by the Balkan Wars, or indeed, the succession of crises in the mid to late 1930s, piling up, becoming more unmanageable, and then suddenly morphing into a genuine world war. I'll talk about this next, my last lecture, but it just does seem to me that if Xi Jinping is serious about getting Taiwan back being his life's work, and that this is the great symbol, and indeed cornerstone, of China's reassertion of its position, historical position as one of the world's truly great leading powers, he's got to coerce Taiwan. He's never going to get the place back without coercing it. And then we're going to be in very interesting territory to see just exactly what the Americans will do and what the Japanese will do. The one thing I think you can be pretty sure is that at this end we'll do nothing. And I don't altogether blame us for that. Good. All right, I've finished and I haven't croaked myself to death. Do ask questions if you want until my voice completely disappears. I think I might sit down, actually. Who wants to ask? Katrina, I saw you first, yes.